Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre and often ridiculous final moments of those who were supposed to be the most dignified humans alive: royalty. Kings, queens, emperors. Their lives were filled with ceremony, power, and gold-threaded robes. But their deaths? Well, let's just say some of them would rather be forgotten. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Death by desert. Of all the ways for a monarch to exit this world: in battle, by betrayal, or on a velvet deathbed surrounded by sobbing nobles, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden chose desert. It was February 1771, a chilly evening, and Adolf Frederick, like many of us after a stressful day of doing absolutely nothing important, decided to treat himself. Except his idea of a treat was more of a culinary suicide mission. The royal menu that night was ambitious. It began with lobster, then caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Not a single glass several. Enough to make even the royal wig spin. But none of that did him in. What truly proved fatal was 14 servings of semla. If you're not Scandinavian, semla is a decadent sweet roll made from wheat and cardamom, filled with almond paste, topped with whipped cream, and served swimming in warm milk. It's delicious, heavy, and rich, the kind of dessert where even one is enough to lull you into a sugar nap. Adolf Frederick had 14. That's not indulgence. That's a sugar-based assassination. His servants must have been stunned, watching as he moved from one roll to the next, likely too intimidated to interrupt. Somewhere between roll 10 and 13, perhaps someone softly suggested, "Your Majesty, a digestive walk, perhaps?" But the king, spoon in hand and cream on his lips, waved them off, determined to savor every last bite. That night, stomach cramps became pain, pain became collapse, and collapse became silence. The official record lists digestive complications, but the reality was indulgence taken to its absolute extreme. His reign had been peaceful, his reforms modest, but his exit was anything but. A monarch undone, not by sword or scheme, but by whipped cream and cardamom. There are worse ways to go. He wasn't betrayed, he didn't fall from a horse, and no poisoned goblet crossed his lips. He was undone by dessert. And honestly, in its own strange, syrupy way, that's kind of majestic. So next time you reach for a second slice of cake and hear that little voice in your head whisper, "Why not?" just remember King Adolf Frederick, and maybe, just maybe, put the spoon down. King George II, Royal Lou exit. Royalty tends to imagine its final moments with a bit of ceremony, a noble farewell, a fading breath in Latin, perhaps a string quartet playing softly in the corner. But King George II of Great Britain exited life on the most unceremonious of thrones, the toilet. Yes, it's true. It was the morning of October 25th, 1760. The king, well into his 70s, awoke feeling a bit unwell, but carried on with his morning routine. A bit of conversation, perhaps some mild royal complaints, and then, as all must do eventually, a visit to the privy. But this time, he didn't return. Servants, noticing the absence, cautiously entered and discovered their sovereign slumped lifeless over the chamber pot. A sudden aortic aneurysm had taken him instantly. Technically natural causes, but the scene was far from dignified. Imagine, the defender of the faith, Elector of Hanover, ruler of an empire departing mid-movement, trousers metaphorically and literally at half-mast. The chamber pot, while likely adorned with fine porcelain and gilded trim, was still a chamber pot. Even the most stoic attendants must have exchanged glances they'd never forget. The official story was sanitized, of course. Heart failure, they said, And it was true. But the full tale slipped through the velvet curtains of court gossip. No bard would sing of this, no oil painting would immortalize it. But the details survived, etched into the margins of history by those who couldn't let it go. And how could they? For all his imperial deeds, reforms, and battles, George II is remembered most vividly for dying as so many men do alone in the restroom. It's a reminder that no matter how high your crown, some things in life and death remain humbling. He ruled an empire and died like a man. Sigurd the Mighty, bitten by a dead man. Some royal deaths are tragic, others absurd. And then there's Sigurd the Mighty, a Viking warlord who met his end in a way that defies belief. He was a conqueror, a fearless fighter, a terror along the coasts, and yet what ultimately claimed him was a tooth. Not one from a living foe, but from a man already long dead. In the 9th century, Sigurd the Mighty, also known as Sigurd Eysteinsson, ruled Orkney with brutal efficiency. His enemies feared him, and his campaigns left whole regions trembling. In a battle against a Scottish chieftain named Mael Brit, Sigurd emerged victorious. As was custom in the brutal theater of Viking warfare, he decapitated his rival and took the head as a trophy, proudly tying it to his saddle. It bounced and jostled as he rode home, the grim spoils of war swinging with each hoofbeat. But in the chaos of victory, no one considered the teeth. One sharp, unrelenting incisor scraped Sigurd's leg during the ride. It was a scratch, a trivial thing. But trivial scratches can become fateful when you live in an age without penicillin or hygiene protocols. Infection set in quickly. The mighty Viking who had outlived swords, storms, and sagas was felled by a decaying tooth and the tiniest wound. The irony is almost poetic. A fierce warrior brought down by the last whisper of his enemy, spite. Historians still debate the precise details, but one truth remains. Sigurd's story lingers not for how he lived, but for the strangeness of how he died. Some say his men laughed, others wept, and most likely they simply untied the head and rode on in silence. His legend remains a quiet, ironic footnote in the saga of the Norse, proof that sometimes the dead have the last laugh. He might be the only Viking in history who lost a duel to dental hygiene. Crown Prince Sado, death by rice chest. There are royal deaths that make you chuckle, and then there are those that leave you still, solemn and strangely cold. Crown Prince Sado of Korea belonged to the latter, a prince of the Joseon dynasty, born to rule, raised in splendor, and remembered only for the box that became his tomb. Sado was not well. Accounts describe violent outbursts, paranoid ramblings, and bloodshed that left his courtiers silent and afraid. He wandered the palace at night, muttering, sword in hand, fear painted into the corners of the royal household. His father, King Yangzhou, was a strict Confucian ruler, one who valued balance, reputation, and above all, control. But what to do when your son is a threat to everyone around him? Execution was unthinkable, too messy, too scandalous, but silence was deadly too. The king made his choice. In mid-July, beneath the punishing sun, Crown Prince Sado was placed inside a rice chest, a wooden box used to store grain. There was no trial, no procession, just wood, nails, and the unyielding air of finality. Days passed, 8 to be exact. No water, no food, no light, only the creeping warmth of summer and the slow, suffocating press of heat and darkness. He died not with a scream, but in stillness. The official story called it divine judgment, but everyone knew he was boxed to death. His son, King Jongjo, would go on to be one of Korea's greatest monarchs, a ruler beloved and wise. But the chest was never spoken of, not officially, not openly, only in hushed tones, behind scrolls and silken screens. Sado's death is a reminder that palaces hold secrets, and that sometimes the walls whisper of boxes, and of silence that lasts for centuries. So next time you're complaining about tight spaces or summer heat, just remember Crown Prince Sado, and be thankful no one's solving family drama with furniture. King Martin of Aragon, killed by laughter. If you've ever been told that laughter is the best medicine, allow us to introduce you to the one man in history who quite literally overdosed on it. King Martin of Aragon, ... The year was 1410. Martin, nearing the end of his reign and battling digestive issues, because no royal story is complete without gastrointestinal drama, had spent the day in bed. Not from injury, but from chronic flatulence and indigestion, a kind of royal wind that clears out courtiers. That evening, in search of distraction from the discomfort that had become his daily companion, he summoned his jester. He asked, simply, for a joke, something light, something absurd, anything to lift the gloom that hung over the royal bedchamber. The jester obliged. The joke, preserved with bemused reverence in royal chronicles, went like this. "Why did you take so long to arrive?" asked the king. To which the jester replied, "Because I saw a young deer hanging from a fig tree by its tail, and I had to wonder whether it was an act of divine punishment." It was, admittedly, a strange joke, but for whatever reason be it, the timing, the fatigue, or the delirium that often follows a stubborn bellyache King Martin burst into laughter. It rolled out of him in waves, uncontrollable and unexpected. It had been weeks since he'd laughed. The moment was pure, cathartic, and ultimately fatal. Within moments, he was gasping for air, clutching his belly, and then suddenly, still. The official cause was recorded as indigestion and excessive mirth. He quite literally laughed himself to death. There's something quietly tragic about it. Monarchs are supposed to die heroically, on the battlefield, in echoing marble halls, or while whispering words of wisdom, not mid-giggle over a deer and a fig tree. Yet that's exactly how Martin of Aragon departed. The chaos that followed, political unrest, a contested succession, was overshadowed by the surreal nature of his demise. Even those in power struggled to recount it with a straight face. And perhaps that's his legacy. A king whose final breath was taken between laughter and gasps, proving that even joy in excess can be dangerous. So laugh wisely, friends, especially after dinner. If ever there was a man determined not to die, it was Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, and the kind of ruler who didn't he just ponder immortality, he demanded it. His rule in the 3rd century BCE was marked by sweeping reforms. He standardized currency, weights, and writing systems, commissioned roads and walls, and built the famous terracotta army, thousands of life-sized warriors meant to guard him in the afterlife. But Qin Shi Huang had no intention of reaching the afterlife anytime soon. Obsessed with longevity, he turned to court alchemists and physicians, tasking them with discovering the secret to eternal life. Their answer: mercury pills, shimmering silvery capsules labeled as elixirs of immortality. The logic was thin, the science non-existent, but they sparkled, and in ancient China, sparkle suggested power. The emperor consumed these toxic concoctions daily, believing he was swallowing time itself. Instead, he was inviting decay. His health deteriorated. He grew increasingly paranoid and withdrawn, embarking on mysterious expeditions in search of mythical ingredients. On one such journey through the eastern provinces, his body finally gave out, poisoned not by enemies, but by his own desire to outlive death. The court, panicking, concealed his demise. To mask the odor of decomposition, they reportedly traveled with a cart of rotting fish. Yes, the emperor who most feared mortality spent his final days fermenting beside seafood. To this day, his tomb remains sealed. Some scholars believe it holds rivers of liquid mercury fitting for a man who believed death could be swallowed like a tonic. And in the end, Qin Shi Huang did find a form of immortality, not as a living god, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of false hope, shimmering promises, and the toxic pursuit of forever. The papacy has seen its fair share of drama, political feuds, spiritual reform, crusades, and scandal. But few popes have ever walked the blurred line between sacred and profane, quite like Pope John XII. Born Octavianus, he became pope at the tender age of 18 in the year 955, ascending to spiritual leadership before he was even old enough to rent a chariot. The results were dramatic. His papal court quickly earned a reputation more befitting a decadent Roman noble than a vicar of Christ. Gambling, drinking, and wild feasts became routine. He was accused of blessing a soldier's mistress, ordaining children as bishops, and toasting to the devil during Mass. Whispers of debauchery swirled around the Vatican like incense. So when the end came, no one was surprised, except perhaps by the details. Multiple chroniclers agree. Pope John XII died of a stroke, but not during prayer, not in a moment of reflection or divine service. No, he reportedly suffered that stroke while in bed with a married woman. Imagine that the shepherd of souls fell mid-affair, tangled in sheets that were not his own. The Vatican, predictably, remained silent. No official record confirmed the story. But the rumor survived, passed from scholar to scholar, too salacious to discard. Even centuries later, historians still debate it. Was it fact or smear? It hardly matters, because the image lingers uncheckable and unforgettable. A pope who abandoned the sacred so completely that not even his final moment could find a shred of sanctity. He reigned for less than a decade, but managed to shake the foundation of papal decorum. Pope John XII remains infamous not only for how he died, but for how wholeheartedly he ignored what it meant to live as a pope. He came, he sinned, he stroked out, and history, with a reluctant smirk, took note. Royal duties can be dangerous. Wars, plots, poisons, there's always some lurking threat. But King Alexander of Greece, he was killed by a monkey. Yes, a monkey. It was 1920, and Greece teetered on the edge of political crisis. Alexander, young and inexperienced, had been placed on the throne while his father lived in exile. He was more a placeholder than a ruler, a ceremonial figure wearing a crown that didn't quite fit. One quiet afternoon, Alexander was walking through the royal gardens with his dog when a Barbary macaque clever, aggressive monkey kept by a palace worker appeared. The dog and the monkey clashed, snarling and scratching. Alexander, like any devoted pet owner, intervened. That's when a second monkey joined in. In an instant, both monkeys turned on the king, biting his legs and inflicting wounds that seemed minor at first. He was bandaged, reassured, and sent to recover. But recovery never came. Within days, infection took hold, then gangrene, then sepsis. Within 3 weeks, the king was dead. The press floundered, unsure how to frame it. Unfortunate accident and sudden illness replaced the truth. But the truth trickled out anyway. A monkey bite had unraveled a monarchy. His death triggered a national crisis, the recall of his father, and a chain of events that plunged Greece deeper into instability. His reign, though brief and unremarkable, was overshadowed by its absurd conclusion. 2 unnamed monkeys became the silent architects of royal catastrophe, and King Alexander forever became the answer to one of history's strangest questions. Which monarch was killed in a monkey fight? When you think of royal death, your mind might conjure images of swordplay, poison, or perhaps a dramatic collapse during a banquet. But King Charles, the second of never known, unflatteringly as Charles, the bad met his end in a way that was both absurd and alarmingly flammable. By the late 14th century, Charles was in failing health, his body weakened by years of political betrayal, illness, and possible degenerative disease. The treatments of the day were primitive at best, dangerous at worst. In an attempt to stimulate his failing limbs, his physician ordered a peculiar remedy. Charles was to be wrapped from head to toe in brandy-soaked linen bandages. The idea was to invigorate the skin, to draw out whatever illness plagued him, but the method came with risks. Brandy, after all, is highly flammable. Late one night, as a servant completed the ritual, sealing the final wrap with a thread, they reached for a candle to snip the thread clean. The flame caught the bandages. Within seconds, the king was engulfed. Shouts rang out, but the damage was swift and merciless. Charles, cocooned in alcohol-soaked linen, burned alive. The scene must have been horrific: sheets, flames, the scent of scorched silk and flesh. The official report, of course, was sanitized. Few details were recorded, but the whispers endured. Charles the Bad, King of Navarre, undone not by blade or betrayal, but by a careless candle and a bit too much brandy. His death became a cautionary tale about remedies gone wrong and servants too weary to notice a spark. A monarch reduced to ash by the flick of a flame, and a legend born from smoke and silence. And general unpleasantness. His doctors, equipped with the finest medieval understanding of medicine, which is to say, none came up with a cutting-edge treatment, wrapped the king from head to toe in linen soaked in brandy. That's right, brandy bandages. Because when in doubt, marinate the monarch. The idea was to warm his body, draw out the illness, and possibly pickle him back to health. It might have even worked, had the final step not involved sewing him into the linen cocoon and leaving a servant to snip the thread. Enter the candle. The servant, working late by flickering candlelight, leaned in to make the final cut. And then, as court historians describe with both horror and a flicker of dark amusement, the flame touched the linen. Now, remember, Charles was soaked in alcohol. He went up like a torch. The servant panicked. There was screaming, chaos, probably a few nobles fainting in the corridor. But by the time they extinguished the king, it was far too late. Charles, too, died in one of the most undignified ways imaginable, accidentally barbecued by his own nurse. The irony was thick. A man who had spent his entire life weaving traps for others, plotting betrayals, and switching allegiances was ultimately undone by a drip-dry bandage and one inattentive assistant. And so Charles the Bad, who had once ruled with fire and fear, met his end as literal firewood. Let it be a quiet lesson. Never mix royal treatments with open flame, especially if your nickname is already the Bad. Some royal deaths are dramatic. Some are symbolic. And then there's King Edmund II of England, who allegedly met his end in the most vulnerable position a man can be in, sitting on the toilet. Known as Edmund Ironside because the second just wasn't intimidating enough, he reigned for only 7 months in the year 1016. His nickname came from battlefield grit, a reputation earned by refusing to yield to the relentless advances of Danish invaders, particularly King Canute the Great, who was inching his way into England's crown. Edmund fought with the tenacity of a lion. He endured defeat, betrayal, and political upheaval. He embodied strength. But the moment he is remembered for well, it happened in the privy. According to a persistent and suspiciously vivid medieval rumor, Edmund was assassinated while using the toilet. A killer, knowing the king's schedule and digestive patterns, allegedly hid beneath the wooden seat. And when Edmund sought betrayal from below, a dagger, a fatal strike. Gruesome? Yes. Dignified? Not remotely. The official record remains hazy. Some say he died from battle wounds. Others vaguely cite private treachery. But certain chroniclers, seemingly delighted by drama, describe the attack with unsettling specificity, down to the killer lurking in the cesspit like some unholy jack-in-the-box. It feels like political slander, and yet the tale stuck. Because nothing erodes a royal legacy quite like a latrine ambush. Imagine the scene. Edmund, finally believing the campaign was over, humming a victory tune, and then thud. It's not the stuff of murals. It's the stuff of cautionary tavern tales. And if the assassination story is true, well, it was nothing if not cunning. A king is never more defenseless than when seated. No armor, no sword, just trust in privacy and 11th century plumbing. Whether truth or folklore, Edmund II's demise reminds us that even kings of iron have soft spots, especially when seated. Of all the fatal indulgences in royal history, King Henry I of England may take the prize for the most slippery. Because in 1135, the king who had ruled for over 3 decades survived wars, political backstabbing, and rebellious nobles was finally undone by a plate of lampreys. If you're unfamiliar, lampreys are jawless, eel-like fish with nightmarish circular mouths lined with teeth. In Henry's time, they were considered a delicacy. Today, we might call them aquatic horrors, but Henry adored them. He was known to obsess over them, and despite repeated warnings from his physicians, who, to be fair, knew very little about digestion, but a lot about avoiding blame, he consumed them in excessive amounts. They were heavy, greasy, and hard on the royal gut. Did Henry care? Of course not. He was a king. And what is a crown for, if not for defying common sense? During a visit to Normandy, he sat down to a lavish meal and indulged in a surplus of lampreys. Far too many of those slick, slippery medieval sea creatures. Likely boiled, unseasoned, and piled high on a silver dish. Shortly after, the symptoms began. Stomach cramps, vomiting, fever, the full royal gastrointestinal catastrophe. Within days, Henry was dead. The cause, food poisoning. His body was embalmed and sent back to England in the freezing winter, but medieval preservation methods were, shall we say, unsophisticated. The journey was long and the details unpleasant. But history remembers this much. Henry I, a sharp and often ruthless monarch, was ultimately felled not by war, not by betrayal, but by a dinner he loved too much. It's said his doctors begged him to stop, and his response? I'd rather die than give up lampreys. Mission accomplished. Kings have died in battle. Kings have died of illness. But King James II of Scotland? He died by standing too close to his own cannon. It was 1460. James, just 29 years old, was known for 2 things: a fiery temper and a deep fascination with artillery. This was the golden age of cannon warfare. If golden meant unpredictable, volatile, and prone to explosive accidents. At the time, James was laying siege to Roxburgh Castle, a critical English stronghold. Eager to show off his newest cannons, he insisted on watching one fire up close. Too close. As the cannon was being fired, it exploded, violently, instantly, spectacularly. A fragment of the barrel ripped through James's thigh, severing his leg, and depending on the account, part of his torso. Death came swiftly. His stunned attendants fled in shock, probably unsure how to phrase, "Your Majesty just exploded." His unexpected demise sent the Scottish army into brief disarray, though they eventually rallied and took the castle. It was later renamed James's Castle, a tribute with more irony than affection. The ultimate twist? James had championed artillery reform. He adored the thunder and smoke, the spectacle of firepower. What he didn't adore, apparently, was standing at a safe distance. And so he became one of history's rare monarchs to be undone by his own enthusiasm. A cautionary tale wrapped in gunpowder and a lack of foresight. Today, James II is remembered not for diplomacy, nor conquest, but for the moment when curiosity and pride put him in the blast zone. It would be Emperor Elgabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, which already sounds like a spell. He became emperor in 218 AD, just 14 years old. That's right, a teenage emperor. Combine that with near unlimited power, vast wealth, and a complete disregard for anything resembling restraint, and you get one of the most bizarre reigns in Roman history. Elgabalus didn't merely bend rules, he melted them down and made jewelry out of them. He appointed a horse as a government official, a favorite pastime among eccentric Roman rulers, and insisted on being addressed not as emperor, but as empress. His theatrical flair extended to hosting lavish feasts where guests were showered with rose petals, so many, in fact, that some guests reportedly suffocated under the floral deluge. His personal life was equally extravagant and unpredictable. He is said to have married 5 times, one of those unions allegedly to a Vestal virgin, a move that was both illegal and unthinkable. He delighted in dressing in women's garments, adorning himself with makeup, and openly offered great sums of money to any physician who could surgically transform him into a woman. Today, we might describe Elagabalus as gender non-conforming, or perhaps fluid, but in ancient Rome, such behavior was a scandal clad in silk and gold. While many Roman elites whispered in dismay over his appearance, it was his open contempt for Rome's sacred traditions that truly sealed his fate. Elagabalus attempted to replace Jupiter, the revered king of the gods, with Elagabal, a sun deity from his native Syria. He even built a grand temple in the heart of the city and forced Roman senators to watch as he danced in religious ecstasy around a sacred black stone. Eventually, the Praetorian Gargones' heavily armed problem solvers had reached their limit. In 222 A.D., they assassinated both Elagabalus and his mother. Their bodies were dragged unceremoniously through the streets before being thrown into the Tiber River as the Roman Empire tried to quietly erase the chaos. Elagabalus was only 18 when he died, a teenager with unchecked power, boundless eccentricity, and vanishing impulse control. Historians still argue, was he a misunderstood revolutionary, or just a silk-draped whirlwind of excess? But most agree on one point. His reign wasn't simply unconventional. It was too strange, too brazen, and for Rome, simply too much. Catherine the Great, rumors that outlived her. Few rulers in history had reputations as grand or as scandalously misunderstood as Catherine the Great of Russia. She was a brilliant reformer, a patron of the arts, a political powerhouse who expanded the Russian Empire and exchanged ideas with Voltaire. But if her name arises at a dinner party, chances are someone will mumble something about a horse. Let's be clear from the start. No, Catherine did not die in any bizarre encounter with a stallion. That persistent myth, absurd and entirely baseless, was fabricated by her enemies after her death. It has no foundation in reality and reveals more about the cruelty of 18th century gossip than the woman it slanders. The real story? Catherine died of a stroke in 1796 at the age of 67 quietly while using the toilet. She collapsed in her private chambers and never regained consciousness. A quiet, unglamorous end for a woman who had ruled one of the world's most powerful empires. So how did the ridiculous horse rumor take hold? During her lifetime, Catherine made formidable enemies, political rivals, jealous nobles, and foreign adversaries. She was a woman ruling alone in a deeply patriarchal society, unapologetically intelligent, confident in her sexuality, and unafraid of power. That combination made her an easy target. Yes, she had lovers many monarchs did, but her personal life became cannon fodder for enemies who found her very existence threatening. The difference was simple. While male rulers were praised for their appetites, Catherine was shamed for hers. After her death, her critics seized their opportunity, and the slander was tailor-made to endure. It stuck not because it made sense, but because it was too lurid to forget. Like a grotesque headline from a scandal sheet, it had staying power. And so, despite her accomplishments modernizing Russia, expanding its territory, encouraging education, and bringing Enlightenment ideas to a conservative court, she remains tethered in the public imagination to a myth that never dies. In the end, she didn't perish in some grand spectacle or scandal. She died as many do privately, quietly, and humanely. History, however, rarely offers that same kindness. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Power may be fleeting, but rumors have long legs. especially when they involve horses. Emperor Valentinian II. The bathtub death no one can explain. Most royal deaths come with explanations: illness, betrayal, or perhaps a culinary misadventure. But Emperor Valentinian II of Rome left behind a death that still floats uneasily in the pool of historical mystery. It was the year 392 A.D. Valentinian was just 21 years old. Technically, he had been emperor since the age of 4, a title given in name but not in power. Like many child rulers, the real authority lay with others. In Valentinian's case, that man was the powerful general Arbogast. Arbogast wasn't subtle. He ruled from the shadows, using Valentinian as little more than a decorative puppet in a palace of pretense. But as the emperor aged, he began to pull against the strings. Tensions built behind marble walls. Whispers thickened in the halls. Something was coming. Then, on an unremarkable morning, Valentinian was found dead. Not slain in a political uprising, not taken by illness, but drowned in his bath. No signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. Just a silent, floating body in the tub, suspended in water, and enigma. Arbogast claimed it was suicide, but to many, that seemed too convenient. Valentinian had only just begun asserting his will. He was young, defiant, and far from broken. Suicide? Possible, but unlikely. Political murder? That seemed much more Ramon, yet the truth remains elusive. Forensic investigation in the 4th century consisted of vague guesses and priestly shrugs. With no solid proof, the mystery lingered. The aftermath, however, was very real. Valentinian's death ignited chaos across the Western Roman Empire. Arbogast installed a new puppet, and yet another civil war cracked the already fragile imperial structure. All of it sparked by a quiet death in warm water. Emperor Valentinian II's passing may not have involved battle cries or poison chalices, but it wins a unique prize, an eerie silence that has echoed for over 1,600 years. Because if history whispers anything clearly, it's this: when young emperors drown in bathtubs, someone likely helped. In the sun-drenched city of Argos, where marble temples gleamed and the sea breeze tangled with the scent of olive trees, a frail girl named Telesilla was born into a life of quiet expectation. Her family was aristocratic, wealthy enough to afford luxury, educated enough to afford poetry. But their daughter was seen as delicate, sickly, and unlikely to leave much mark on the world beyond the home's shaded courtyards. From a young age, Telesilla suffered from chronic illness. We don't know exactly what ailed her. Ancient sources rarely grant such precision, but she spent much of her childhood bedridden, a quiet presence behind gauzy curtains. In a culture that revered athletic prowess and public contribution, especially from men, her physical limitations could have consigned her to obscurity. But where her body weakened, her inner world flourished. Retreating inward, she found companionship not in play or politics, but in poetry. Lines of verse became her solace. Rhythm was her resistance. She did not merely write, she composed with the fluency others used to breathe. Her poems praised Apollo, Artemis, and Athena, gods of clarity, healing, and wisdom. And perhaps, through that devotion, something shifted. The ancient traveler Pausanias wrote that her health began to improve, not through medicine, but through the act of creation. Day by day, Telesilla found new strength. Whether through spiritual rituals or the spark of purpose, she rose from her bed not just healed, but transformed. No longer a silent girl in the shadows, she emerged as a poet of renown. Her name passed from mouth to mouth in symposiums and salons. Her words became a kind of gentle revolution, awakening pride and resilience among the women of Argos. She was no longer just a poet. She was a voice for her city. And though no one could yet know it, that voice would soon lead not just in verse, but in defiance. Because this poetess wasn't done surprising the world, not by a long shot. As Telesila's name grew within Argos, her home became a place of quiet reverence, not for wealth or beauty, but for her words. She wrote with a particular focus on the gods, especially Apollo and Artemis, the divine siblings of healing, precision, and purity. Her hymns didn't merely praise, they invoked presence. These were not empty rituals. These were spiritual calls to arms of the soul. Her verses were likely recited at temples and sacred festivals, sung by choruses of young women dressed in white, their voices rising beneath sunlit columns. Through her poetry, Tela provided not only spiritual expression, but also emotional education. She reminded the people of Argos, especially its women, that they too were part of the divine tapestry. They weren't merely spectators in a male-dominated mythos. They were woven into the narrative. And while men debated politics in the Agora, it was Tela's verses that seeped into the minds of Argive daughters. In a world where education for women was rare, poetry became their inheritance. Her hymns taught them reverence, strength, even defiance, wrapped delicately in metaphor and rhythm. But it was more than just literature. For Telesilla, these hymns were medicine. Ancient accounts suggest that her devotion to poetic discipline helped cure her lifelong illness. Though we might roll our eyes at the idea of writing your way to health, there's something timeless in this concept. She found purpose, and perhaps in doing so, she found resilience. The more she wrote, the more she stood. The more she stood, the more people listened. And Argos needed her voice because war was coming. The city had been growing complacent, leaning too heavily on its past glories and underestimating the tensions rising around it. Sparta, that eternal neighbor to the south, had already shown its teeth more than once. And while the men of Argos continued their debates, no one suspected that a poet, the once sickly girl who healed herself with verse, would soon become their rallying cry. In many ways, Telesilla was already preparing her city. Her hymns didn't just soothe, they steeled. They became quiet rehearsals for something louder, bloodier, and more urgent. When the time came, the women of Argos would already know the rhythm of defiance, because she had already taught them how to sing it. The year was around 494 BCE, and Argos stood on the edge of disaster. Tensions with Sparta had finally snapped. The Battle of Sepia erupted in ambush, staged with Spartan precision and Argive miscalculation. The Argive men, confident in their numbers and tradition, fell into a trap laid by King Cleomenes of Sparta. It was brutal, systematic, a massacre dressed in strategy. Hundreds of Argive soldiers were slaughtered. Some say nearly the entire male fighting force of the city was wiped out. What remained was a shell of a city, its gates open, its warriors dead, its fate seemingly sealed. Argos lay defenseless. And Sparta knew it. What Cleomenes didn't know, what perhaps no one could have predicted, was that behind those bloodied city walls was not just grief and ruin. There was Telesilla. In the aftermath of the battle, as wails of mourning echoed through marble halls and temples, it would have been easy expected, even for the people of Argos to surrender. Many probably considered it, but somewhere among the collapsed morale, Telesilla stepped forward, not with a spear, but with fire in her eyes. She rallied the women. The story, preserved in fragments by later historians like Plutarch and Porcius, is nothing short of astounding. Telesilla, the poetess once confined by illness, now stood before her fellow citizens, mothers, daughters, widows, and called them to arms. Literally. They gathered every weapon they could find, spears once mounted on walls, shields left behind by the fallen, even stones and farming tools repurposed as weapons. And in the shadow of that ancient city, women began training the elderly, the young, even the servants. They all prepared for what was coming. Telesilla organized it. This wasn't some mythic fever dream. It was strategy. She positioned women at the top battlements to give the illusion that Argos was still fully defended. She drilled them in formations. They were not trained soldiers, but they were fierce, determined, and above all, furious. The city waited, breath held. The Spartans would return. Everyone knew it. But when they did, expecting a broken city ready to kneel, they found something else entirely. A wall lined with women, armed and prepared, led by a poet with no crown, no title, just command in her voice. Argos had fallen, and now it would rise again. The Spartan army returned expecting plunder. After all, they had decimated Argos's military. What remained, they assumed, were civilians too broken to fight back, an easy conquest, maybe even a lesson in Spartan mercy. But what greeted them at the gates of Argos was no surrender. It was spectacle, it was defiance, it was telesilla. The walls were lined with women, fully armed, their eyes steady, their posture unshaken. Their commander, a woman once known only for poetry, now stood tall, directing strategy like a general born of war. And then the women attacked. The battle was not elegant. This was not the heroic ideal of shield walls and bronze-plated honor. It was chaos furious, unrelenting, and intimate. These women fought with whatever they had. Spears stabbed from above the ramparts. Boiling water scalded Spartan helmets. Stones rained like curses. It was as much psychological as it was physical. The Spartans, trained for disciplined combat against soldiers, were suddenly locked in brutal melee with people they were not prepared to kill women. And that hesitation cost them. Pausanias, who recorded the tale centuries later, wrote that the women of Argos, under Telesilla's leadership, forced the Spartans to retreat. It sounds improbable, doesn't it? But context matters. The Spartans had won their main objective. They had already defeated Argos's male army. What they faced now was resistance that risked shattering the legend of Spartan invincibility. To lose men to a citizen militia, led by women, wasn't just dangerous. It was humiliating. And humiliation in Sparta was worse than death. So they withdrew. Let that settle for a moment. Telesilla, a poet, trained not in arms, but in verse, had led a group of grieving, enraged, determined women and saved a city, not in myth, not in allegory, but in recorded human history. This victory wasn't just military. It was symbolic. It changed the narrative of Argos. It redefined what women could do in the face of devastation. And it proved something Sparta hadn't expected. That courage doesn't wear a beard. And leadership isn't born only on the battlefield. That day, Argos didn't fall to Sparta. It stood taller than ever, held up by hands that had once only held lyres. And it was Telesilla who handed the city its second breath. Victory had a strange taste. The city of Argos had survived, but it was changed. Its streets still echoed with grief. Its temples bore the bloodstains of husbands, brothers, and sons who never came home. But over all that silence stood something remarkable. A new kind of legacy, stitched together by women's hands and Telesilla's unshakable resolve. She didn't claim power. She didn't crown herself queen or sit upon a throne. Telesilla returned to her poetry. It might seem anticlimactic, but this was precisely her genius. She didn't fight for personal glory. She fought because her city needed her. And once Argos was safe, she resumed what she loved, composing hymns and honoring the gods. But now her verses had new weight. They weren't just lyrics sung at festivals. They were reminders, living memory set to meter. Imagine the girls of Argos growing up in the shadow of that victory, whispering stories of the poet general who once led their mothers into battle. Imagine their voices reciting her verses under moonlight, not just as ritual, but as power. Telesilla's poetry had become prophecy, and prophecy had become precedent. The city honored her not just in song, but in stone. A statue was erected in the temple of Aphrodite, showing Telesilla seated calmly with scrolls at her feet, one hand upon her lyre, the other resting on her shield, not as a contradiction, but as a complete truth. She was both artist and warrior, and she had shown her city that those identities were not only compatible, they were necessary. Elsewhere in Greece, the story spread. Telesilla became a symbol not only of Argive resilience, but of womanly courage in a world that rarely allowed such narratives to breathe. Philosophers debated her, poets echoed her themes, and in time her name was preserved in collections of heroic women, standing shoulder to shoulder with queens and oracles. But perhaps most powerful of all was the silence that followed. She didn't chase war. She didn't court conflict. Her defense of Argos was an act of necessity, not ego. When peace returned, so did she to her ink, to her rhythm, to the private sacred space where poems were born. And in doing so, she proved that real strength isn't measured in how long you hold the sword, but in knowing exactly when to put it down. Telesilla's name began to stretch beyond the city walls of Argos, carried not by armies, but by admirers. Her story, part history, part legend, was whispered in symposiums, etched into scrolls, and retold in hushed admiration by men who never thought they'd speak of a woman as both poet and protector. She was not mythologized into a goddess. She remained human, and that made her all the more powerful. Her dual legacy resonated deeply across the Greek world because it broke a mold that many didn't realize could be broken. In an era when women were expected to be silent, invisible, or ornamental, Telesilla was none of those things. She was educated, expressive, and when the moment came, fierce. And yet, even her poetry was not lost to time. Some of her verses survived, cited by later grammarians and scholars. Though fragmentary, they suggest a rich, reverent tone filled with invocations of the divine, vivid imagery, and a deep understanding of ritual. She didn't just write, she shaped the sacred. It's difficult to say how much of her work has vanished into history's abyss. Like so many women of antiquity, her voice was preserved only in pieces, filtered through the pens of men centuries after her death. But even these remnants are enough. They speak of a woman who believed in beauty, in community, in purpose, and in the capacity of language to build more than verse, to build courage, memory, resistance. Artists later depicted her surrounded by scrolls and shields, sometimes crowned with laurel, sometimes simply sitting alone in contemplation, always poised between song and silence, art and action. She inspired later generations of women, though subtly, like a steady flame that never quite goes out. In the Hellenistic period, and even into Roman times, her name appeared in anthologies, a rare inclusion among lists dominated by male voices. Her story wasn't repeated out of novelty. It was repeated because it mattered. Telesilla of Argos wasn't the loudest warrior, nor the most prolific poet, but she was something rarer, a woman who moved between two worlds with grace, fire, and intent. And in doing so, she forced the world to take notice, not with conquest, but with clarity. As centuries passed, the name Telesilla began to fade, not from legend, but from mainstream history. Like so many women of the ancient world, her memory was tucked into footnotes, her achievements mentioned only in fragments, and often with a tone of polite surprise, as though it was somehow an accident that a woman had done something remarkable. The Hellenistic world, with its shifting power centers and cultural transformations, began favoring different kinds of heroes, conquerors, philosophers, kings. In this new climate, a woman poet who defended her city with wit and will didn't quite fit the mold of the stories that empires like to tell. By the time Roman authors picked up her name, it was almost folkloric. Plutarch mentions her with a kind of rhetorical curiosity, less interested in her verse or her politics, and more in the idea that a woman had ever wielded command at all. To him and many of his contemporaries, Telesilla was an anomaly, a remarkable exception, a rare flower in a man's garden. But this is where history itself betrays us, because it wasn't just Telesilla who vanished from the center of the narrative. It was countless women like her leaders, thinkers, poets, whose stories were deemed too inconvenient to preserve in full. The scrolls were lost, The statues were repurposed or destroyed. The voices were silenced, not by violence, but by centuries of editorial neglect. And yet, Talasila persisted. Her story survived not because it was allowed to, but because it was too compelling to kill. Because the image of a woman standing atop a city wall, shield in one hand, verse in the other, simply refused to go quietly. That kind of image doesn't disappear. It smolders in memory, reignites in times of crisis, and whispers to each new generation that bravery wears many faces, and some of them wear veils. In modern times, historians and feminists alike have begun to revisit her legacy, not to exaggerate it, but to reclaim it, to dust off the silence and examine what happens when we let the full weight of a woman's story stand beside her male counterparts. And in doing so, we don't just remember Talasila. We remember what history tried to forget. Though much of ancient Greece has crumbled, its statues worn smooth, its scrolls turned to dust, Talasila's legacy still lingers in three enduring forms: stone, scroll, and sisterhood. First, the stone. In the ancient sanctuary of Aphrodite Argos, long after the war cries faded, the statue of Talasila once stood. Not a grand marble colossus, but a thoughtful monument. She was depicted seated calmly, her scrolls scattered at her feet, her hand resting on a helmet. No raised sword, no dramatic stance, just a moment of stillness, an image of a woman who had mastered both art and action. Even the placement in Aphrodite's temple was deliberate, not Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, but Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and perhaps here, resilience. It was a quiet revolution carved in stone. Then came the scrolls. Though most of Talasila's poetry is lost, what little remains reveals a voice rich with reverence and clarity. Scholars across centuries have tried to piece together her verses, finding in them not only artistic merit, but emotional insight. Her style belonged to the lyric tradition, intimate, melodic, charged with spiritual devotion. She was not writing for spectacle. She was writing for the soul. And perhaps that's why her words survived longer than her battles. And finally, the sisterhood. Talasila's story became a kind of coded anthem for women through the ages, especially for those denied swords, votes, or recognition. She offered something more enduring than strategy: permission. Permission to act, to speak, to lead, to protect. She wasn't just a historical figure. She was a mirror one in which generations of women could see their own potential reflected, no matter how obscured by time. Her tale has inspired plays, poems, even academic treatises. In feminist readings of ancient history, she is no longer a footnote. She is a cornerstone, a reminder that when institutions fall silent, individuals can still shout. That when history closes a door, memory opens a window. In classrooms, in books, in whispered conversations among those hungry for forgotten heroines, Talasila lives on. She is the patron saint of the underestimated, the poet who chose not only to sing of heroes, but to become one. Talasila never asked to be remembered. She didn't command monuments or beg for her name to be etched in history. And yet here we are, over 2,000 years later, still speaking her name, still telling her story, still awed by what she did in a world that tried to forget her kind. What makes her legacy so compelling is not just that she fought or that she wrote, but that she did both when neither was expected nor allowed of someone like her. A sickly girl with a lyre was never supposed to lead a militia. A woman who composed hymns wasn't meant to rewrite the fate of a city, but she did. And not through divine intervention or noble birth, but through clarity, purpose, and grit. In the grand tapestry of Greek history, full of heroes with bronze muscles and flowing capes, Talasila stands apart. She doesn't roar like Achilles or scheme like Odysseus. She does something far harder. She holds the line. She looks into the face of collapse, and she does not flinch. Not because she was fearless, but because someone had to act and no one else did. And that's what makes her echo last. She reminds us that heroism doesn't always come with a trumpet blast or a poet's blessing. Sometimes it comes in the form of a woman who picks up a sword with shaking hands, steadies herself, and says, "Not today." Today, scholars and creatives alike continue to draw inspiration from her. Her story is taught in feminist studies, referenced in discussions about women in warfare, and even invoked in debates about the fluidity of roles across gender and class. She has become not just a symbol of Argos, but of resistance itself. And if you listen carefully, her voice still hums beneath the surface of modern tales. In every woman who steps up when others step back. In every artist who refuses to stay in their lane. In every act of courage that begins with a whisper and ends in thunder, Tella's legacy is not locked in the past. It is alive, breathing, moving quietly through the world. Because the truth is, the lyre was never put down. It was simply transformed into something sharper. Before arches, before blueprints, before even the idea of architecture, there was a simple human need to get from one side to the other. Across rushing rivers, deep ravines, and perilous chasms, the early ancestors of humanity faced a question as old as travel itself. How do you cross when the land disappears? The very first bridges were not built by engineers. They were stumbled upon by wanderers and hunters who noticed a fallen tree spanning a stream or watched vines drape across a gorge. These early crossings weren't planned. They were found. Nature gave the hint, and humans took the cue. A fallen log, a line of stones placed just right. This was where bridges were born. Out of curiosity, out of fear, out of hunger. Over time, those accidental crossings became intentional. In rainforests, people began binding together vines and reeds to form hanging footpaths. These weren't exactly stable. You wouldn't want to cross one in the dark, but they were a beginning. A literal lifeline between food and famine, isolation and community. In parts of what is now South America, early civilizations began using twisted plant fibers to create longer suspended crossings. These weren't just primitive ropes. They were woven, reinforced, and tested with centuries of refinement. The Incas, long before the Spanish conquest, perfected the art of the rope bridge. But even before the Incan Empire, the peoples of the Andes were mastering techniques that required deep understanding of tension, weight distribution, and natural materials. What makes these early bridges remarkable is not their size, but their boldness. Imagine looking at a river gorge hundreds of feet deep, and instead of walking away, you begin tying grass together. That's not just ingenuity. It's a kind of bravery wrapped in necessity. These first crossings changed more than routes. They changed relationships. Once two valleys were linked, ideas flowed as easily as people. Trade routes emerged. Languages mingled. Cultural exchange was born on shaky ropes and damp planks. A bridge, even the humblest one, is always more than wood and fiber. It's an invitation, a statement, a quiet refusal to let nature have the final say. In those earliest spans, civilizations took their first steps toward connection and never looked back. High in the Andes Mountains, where cliffs dropped like knives and rivers roar with glacial melt, the Inca Empire wove its own answer to nature's brutal geography. The Incas didn't just build bridges. They tied the sky together. Their roads ran for thousands of miles across mountains and valleys. But it was the rope bridges, or Kaswashaka, that truly defied imagination. These bridges were made entirely of grass, not wood, not metal, not stone, just woven strands of ishu, a tough mountain grass twisted into cords, and those cords twisted into cables. The process wasn't just technical, it was ceremonial. Entire villages would gather once a year to build or rebuild these bridges by hand. Each family was responsible for a section of rope. They braided, chanted, and hauled, working in a rhythm passed down through generations. The resulting bridge could stretch across a 100-foot canyon, swaying with every gust of mountain wind. No nails, no bolts, just pure tension and trust. And yet these rope bridges were strong enough to support llamas, soldiers, messengers, and traders. They were the beating arteries of an empire, spanning canyons where no stone could be placed. And they were elegant in their own way, suspended like cobwebs across the void. They moved with the wind instead of fighting it. They bent, swayed, and sighed, but rarely broke. When one did collapse, it wasn't treated as a failure. It was simply the end of a cycle, ready to be born again by the hands of those who lived along its path. These rope bridges weren't just infrastructure, they were sacred. The annual rebuilding was a living ritual, a reminder that the land was not to be conquered but worked with. That connection required not brute force, but harmony. No empire understood this better than the Incas. Even today, one rope bridge remains in use. The last Quishuachaca, still rebuilt annually by local communities near Haneri, Peru. UNESCO has recognized it as intangible cultural heritage. Tourists cross it gingerly. Locals cross it with muscle memory. In a world that increasingly forgets how to repair, the Inca Bridge reminds us of something ancient and vital. That strength doesn't always come from stone. Sometimes it comes from woven grass, shared labor, and the will to meet across the void. Far from the wind-tossed Andes, across the rivers of ancient China, another philosophy of bridge building was taking root, one that favored permanence over flexibility, symmetry over sway. Chinese engineers saw bridges not just as tools, but as expressions of balance, of earth, water, and heaven connected in stone. As early as the Zhou dynasty, Chinese builders had been experimenting with wooden and pontoon bridges. But it was during the Han, and later the Sui and Tang, dynasties that something extraordinary emerged, the segmental arch bridge. Unlike the steep Roman arch, which relied on a high curve, the Chinese approach flattened the arch, giving their bridges a gentle rise and greater stability under dynamic loads like carts and animals. These were not just aesthetic choices. They were masterclasses in tension and compression. Take, for example, the Zhao Bridge, built in the early 7th century by the engineer Li Chun. Spanning 123 feet with a 37-foot-high arch, it remains one of the oldest surviving open spandrel stone bridges in the world. It's not just old, it's brilliant. Li Chun designed it with smaller secondary arches along the base to reduce weight and water resistance during floods. His understanding of both structure and natural forces was centuries ahead of his time. But Chinese bridges weren't only feats of engineering, they were deeply poetic. Many were built near temples or gardens, reflecting ideals of Taoist harmony and the fusion of order and confusion. The bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was a moment, a pause between destinations, a chance to contemplate the still water below and the swirling heavens above. Stone lions often guarded the entrances, not merely as decoration, but as symbols of protection. Bridge names were chosen with care, often invoking luck, longevity, or spiritual awakening. And for scholars and artists of the Tang and Song dynasties, bridges became a favorite subject in painting and verse. A simple walk across one could become a metaphor for everything: change, connection, and the quiet strength of staying still amid motion. In ancient China, bridges were more than civil works. They were spiritual geometry. Each stone laid not just with skill, but with philosophy. To cross one wasn't just to travel, it was to pass through balance itself. If China built with harmony, Rome built with ambition. For the Romans, a bridge wasn't just a way to cross a river. It was a declaration: we are here, and we will stay. As the Roman Empire expanded, it faced an endless parade of rivers, valleys, and gorges. But where others saw obstacles, Rome saw blueprints. The Romans took what the Etruscans had started, arch technology, and turned it into something monumental and permanent. Using stone, concrete, and sheer willpower, Roman engineers constructed bridges that didn't just survive time. They defined it. One of the most famous is the Pons Fabricius, built in 62 BCE, which still carries foot traffic across the Tiber River today. That's more than 2 millennia of wear and war, flood and footstep, and still standing. The genius of the Roman bridge lay in its arch. A Roman arch distributed weight evenly, channeling force into the ground. It allowed bridges to span wider rivers and support heavier loads. And with the invention of pozzolanic concrete, which could set underwater, Roman builders gained a flexibility their rivals couldn't match. But function was never enough for Rome. These bridges were built with grandeur. They were often faced with marble or limestone, inscribed with the names of emperors, adorned with statues and triumphal messages. Some were even designed as part of aqueducts, like the breathtaking Pont du Gard in modern-day France, which served as both a water channel and a towering architectural statement. For Roman legions, bridges meant speed. For Roman merchants, they meant prosperity. And for the empire itself, they meant permanence. The roads of Rome were famously straight and unyielding, but it was the bridges that made those roads matter. Wherever Rome went, it bridged the gap literally and metaphorically between conquest and civilization. A bridge wasn't just infrastructure. It was empire in miniature, orderly, strong, and built to last. Even after the empire fell, many Roman bridges remained used, rebuilt, reimagined. The stones whispered of a time when engineers walked hand in hand with emperors, and when rivers, no matter how wide or wild, bowed to the Roman will. To cross a Roman bridge was to walk in the footsteps of conquerors and to feel the weight of eternity under your feet. While Rome built in stone in China in symmetry, ancient India quietly cultivated a bridge tradition that was unlike anything else on earth. Bridges made from trees. Not cut wood, not rope, not carved beams, but living, growing trees. In the wet, hilly region of Meghalaya in the northeast of the Indian subcontinent, rivers are fed by relentless monsoons. Flash floods sweep away bamboo, rope, and timber bridges with ease. But centuries ago, the Khasi and Jaintia peoples found a way to use nature not as an obstacle, but as a partner. They began guiding the roots of the Ficus elastica tree, a type of rubber fig, across streams and rivers slowly, patiently. Over years, then decades, the roots were trained using hollowed-out tree trunks, scaffolding, and bamboo frames to grow toward the opposite bank. When the roots met, they were woven and anchored into the soil, creating a bridge that was quite literally alive. These living root bridges didn't rot. They didn't splinter. In fact, they grew stronger with age. A young bridge might take 15 years to become usable, but once mature, it could last hundreds of years, sustained by the very land it stood on. This was not fast architecture. It was generational. A grandfather would begin weaving a bridge that his grandchildren might one day walk across. There was no blueprint-only tradition, no calculation-only intuition passed down through watching, doing, and remembering. And these bridges weren't just functional. They were breathtaking, suspended among waterfalls and emerald valleys. The root bridges curved and twisted like something from a fairy tale, organic and surreal, blending into the jungle as if grown by myth. In a world that often values speed, India's living bridges are a defiant slow song. They show that time, care, and cooperation with nature can produce wonders just as lasting as stone. They are community projects, sacred paths, a reminder that not all strength is rigid. Some of it is woven, flexible, and alive. To cross a root bridge is to cross into a different rhythm of civilization, one that listens to the earth rather than reshaping it. And in that quiet balance, India bridged more than rivers. It bridged the wild itself. In the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved ribbons through desert and city, early Mesopotamians faced a familiar problem: rivers that both nourished and separated. These waterways brought trade, irrigation, and life, but they also created boundaries. And where boundaries exist, someone eventually builds a bridge. Unlike the later empires of stone and steel, ancient Mesopotamians worked with what they had: mud, brick, timber, and ingenuity. Their rivers were broad, but not bottomless. Their materials were fragile, but their minds were not. The city of Babylon, one of the jewels of ancient Mesopotamia, was famously divided by the Euphrates River, but it was also famously connected. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed that Babylon had an early movable bridge constructed of wooden planks laid across boats and tied together with papyrus ropes. By day, it ferried people in carts. By night, it was dismantled to prevent enemy access. Whether this account is precise or poetic, it reflects a truth. Mesopotamian cities were not isolated settlements. They were logistical masterpieces. Bridges here were not just structures, they were strategies. Some were built low and temporary, designed to be rebuilt after floods. Others were made with baked bricks and asphalt mortar, resting on foundations driven deep into silt and clay. Mesopotamians understood the river's moods. They didn't try to conquer water with brute force. They tried to work around it, above it, and sometimes even under it. Trade caravans carrying grain, textiles, and lapis lazuli needed bridges. Temples and ziggurats drew pilgrims from opposite shores. And kings, forever in need of control, understood that whoever held the bridge controlled the city. Over time, as empires like the Assyrians and Persians rose, their bridges grew in complexity. Engineers began incorporating stone piers and more permanent wooden spans. But the roots of that engineering went back to the simplest acts: bundling reeds, piling clay, stretching logs. The logic of bridging the why came long before the how. Mesopotamian bridges may not have survived the centuries like Rome's or inspired poetry like China, but they formed a vital foundation. They were among the first expressions of infrastructure, the bones of organized society. They taught us that where there is commerce, there must be connection. And where there is water, someone will always try to walk across it. To the ancient Greeks, the world was not just a place to live. It was a canvas to be shaped, measured, and perfected. And when it came to bridges, they brought the same thoughtful attention to proportion, harmony, and engineering that they poured into their temples and sculptures. Unlike the Romans, the Greeks weren't obsessed with spanning vast distances or showcasing imperial power. Their bridges were often more modest, but no less intelligent. Built across small rivers, marshes, or rocky gaps, these structures were crafted with an elegant balance of form and function. Take the Arkadiko Bridge, located in the Peloponnese and dating back to the Bronze Age, around 1300 BCE. It's one of the oldest surviving arch bridges in the world. Built of large unmortared limestone boulders, the bridge still stands today, quietly carrying foot traffic as it did millennia ago. There are no inscriptions, no imperial eagles, no towering arches, just a single subtle span built with precision and enduring grace. The Greeks understood stone. They understood load-bearing. And perhaps most importantly, they understood the importance of community connectivity. Many of their early roads and bridges were part of sacred routes used during religious festivals and processions to temples, such as the long journey to Delphi or Olympia. In these contexts, a bridge wasn't just about moving people, it was about guiding them toward the divine. Later, during the classical and Hellenistic periods, Greek cities began incorporating more advanced engineering methods, borrowing and adapting Etruscan and Eastern techniques. Timber and stone were used together. Some bridges even included drainage systems, careful grading, and guardrails. Still, aesthetics mattered. A Greek bridge didn't just serve a function. It fit into the landscape, enhancing rather than dominating it. It was common to find bridges positioned for viewing, often offering perfect symmetry with the surrounding hills and sky. Water below, air above, and stone in between. The Greeks liked their elements balanced. In Greek thought, the bridge became more than a crossing. It was a metaphor, a movement between worlds, between cities, between gods and mortals. between chaos and order. So while their spans may not stretch as far as Rome's, the Greek bridge stands as a quiet whisper in stone, strong, serene, and built with thought rather than thunder. In the land of towering pyramids and mighty pharaohs, ancient Egypt didn't need to conquer rivers as often as it needed to navigate them. The Nile, both giver and taker of life, served more as a highway than a barrier. Boats were the bridges of Egypt, but that didn't mean Egyptians ignored the art of crossing land-based gaps. When they did build bridges, they did so with intention and with unmistakable symbolism. Egyptian civilization grew along the fertile banks of the Nile, where irrigation channels, canals, and distributaries spread up the land. To manage this watery maze, the Egyptians developed small-scale bridges, flat stone causeways, wooden crossings, and canal bridges designed more for function than spectacle. One of the earliest known examples comes from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, near the Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists have discovered narrow stone walkways and raised paths designed to carry foot traffic over irrigation ditches and sunken terrain. These weren't monumental in size, but they were smartly built using local stone, carefully leveled surfaces, and alignment with prevailing routes. And then there's the great causeways, those long, sloping stone paths that connected the Nile to the pyramids at Giza. While technically not bridges, these structures acted as ceremonial links between the river and the tombs of the dead. Massive and meticulously constructed, these causeways were used to transport the pharaoh's funerary goods, chariots, and even his mummified body during grand religious processions. In these causeways, we see something more than transport. We see spiritual transition, a passage from life to death, from one world to another. The bridge in Egypt wasn't always a structure you walked across. It was an idea. The soul crossed into the afterlife. The king moved from mortal dust to divine eternity. As Egypt expanded and urbanized, more bridges appeared over canals and smaller water networks, often tied to temple precincts or granary systems. Some were likely made of wood lost to time, but their foundations, stone piers, and embankments remained buried beneath desert and field. The Egyptian bridge was never a monument to conquest. It was a conduit of water, of grain, of sacred memory. Not grand in form, perhaps, but monumental in what it represented. The eternal journey between shores seen and unseen. By the time the ancient world began to fade into the medieval, its bridges remained quiet, immovable witnesses to the ambitions, fears, and brilliance of early civilizations. Some crumbled, buried by flood or forgotten war. Others, remarkably, still stand. A root bridge in India, a Roman arch in France, a Greek limestone span in the Peloponnese, silent but unbroken. What unites all these ancient bridges, whether born of grass, stone, wood, or myth, is that they were acts of faith. Not religious faith necessarily, but human faith. That we could overcome separation, that we could connect what nature had divided, that the people on the other side were worth reaching. Every civilization had its own approach. The Incas used tension. The Romans used compression. The Chinese used curvature. The Mesopotamians used buoyancy. But the principle was the same link: what cannot be left. Make distance irrelevant. And each bridge said something about the people who built it. The Incas trusted time. The Greeks trusted balance. The Egyptians trusted eternity. The Romans, they trusted concrete. But even beyond function and philosophy, bridges told stories. A rope bridge whispered of community. A Roman aqueduct thundered empire. A Chinese stone arch spoke of harmony. They didn't just carry bodies. They carried beliefs, identities, and purpose. Some bridges were born in urgency, built quickly after a war or flood. Others were born in ritual, raised in song, rebuilt in ceremony, maintained not by kings, but by farmers and children. All of them required cooperation. No one builds a bridge alone. You need hands, patience, and hope. And perhaps that is why they still resonate with us today. Not because we re-impressed by ancient tools or clever math, but because we recognize the courage it takes to build something between danger and safety, between isolation and unity, between now and the generations to come. In a world that often pulls itself apart, ancient bridges remind us of something quieter, older, and wiser. That connection is worth the effort. That strength can be gentle. That sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply reach out. So the next time you cross an old bridge, pause. You're walking on the remains of ancient dreams, and they're still holding. Before there were words carved into clay or hymns sung in stone temples, there was sound. Not organized music in the way we know it, but raw, instinctive rhythm, nature's own symphony, waiting to be noticed. The crackling of fire, the patterned drip of rain, the rustle of leaves, the rhythmic thump of feet. These were the first instruments. And somewhere along the way, early humans stopped just listening. They started imitating. The earliest musical instruments known to us come from the Paleolithic period. Among them, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, found in caves in Germany, and dated to over 40,000 years ago. They had holes carefully drilled along their bodies, designed to control pitch, not just make noise. These weren't toys. They were tools of emotion. Imagine it in the flickering dark of a cave, someone gently blowing into a carved bone, the notes echoing like whispers through stone. A lullaby for a child, a chant for the hunt, a sound to soothe the dying or stir the sacred. These first notes weren't just entertainment. They were memory made audible. Early music likely served functional roles. Rhythmic clapping or drumming could synchronize group labor, build morale, or intimidate enemies. Repetition made things memorable. Long before writing, information was sung, not said. Melody was a mnemonic device anchoring knowledge to tone and pattern. The beginning of oral tradition is, in many ways, the beginning of music. In tribal rituals across ancient cultures, we see evidence of percussion instruments, wooden slats, seed rattles, stretched animal skins struck in time. These tools helped bind communities together, providing a shared experience that required no translation. You didn't need to speak the same language to move to the same beat. Music likely emerged alongside and intertwined with spiritual belief. In early burials, we find instruments placed beside the dead: flutes, drums, bells, as if the journey to the next world required accompaniment. Or perhaps the music was meant for the living, echoing with grief, hope, or a longing to reach beyond the veil. In these earliest sounds, we weren't just surviving. We were beginning to express ourselves, to remember, to celebrate, to mourn. Before we built cities or wrote myths, we sang. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved paths of life through desert and clay, music was not a pastime. It was a necessity. From Sumer to Babylon, from temple to tavern, sound shaped identity, order, and the divine. The Mesopotamians didn't just play music, they recorded it, structured it, and tied it tightly to the heavens. Among the earliest visual records of musical culture comes from Sumerian cylinder seals and reliefs dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. These tiny artworks depict musicians holding lyres, flutes, and drums. But the true marvel lies in what archaeologists later uncovered: the lyres themselves. Elaborate instruments adorned with gold, lapis lazuli, and carved bull heads. These were not mere tools. They were sacred objects, buried with the elite, meant to accompany souls into the afterlife. The Mesopotamian lyre was delicate and resonant, its strings stretched across a wooden frame and played with plucking fingers or bone picks. Musicians were professionals, some temple-trained, others court-appointed. Music accompanied rituals, coronations, banquets, and battle. Every occasion had its sound. And then there's the real marvel notation. A clay tablet from Ugarit, dated to around 1400 BCE, is considered one of the world's oldest surviving examples of written music. It contains hymns inscribed in cuneiform, not only with lyrics, but musical instructions using a system of relative pitch. We don't fully understand how to hear it as the ancients did, but the very fact it exists reveals how central music was to structure and spirituality. Music was also tied to cosmology. Numbers mattered. Intervals mattered. Ancient Mesopotamian thinkers, especially those in Babylon, believed music could reflect the order of the cosmos, mirroring the same harmony that kept planets in orbit and seasons on time. This idea would ripple into Greek philosophy centuries later. Whether sung by priestesses to Inanna or played by traveling minstrels in crowded markets, music in Mesopotamia was layered. It was professional, sacred, celebratory, and political. It carried messages between mortals and gods. In a world carved from mud and mystery, music gave shape to things unseen, binding memory to ritual, order to time, and the soul to its story. In ancient Egypt, where gods had animal heads and pharaohs were divine, music flowed like the Nile constant, sacred and life-giving. It echoed in temple courts, drifted through market stalls, and accompanied every stage of human life from birth to burial. Egyptian music wasn't ornamental. It was essential. The Egyptians believed that music had magical properties. It could calm the gods, heal the sick, and guide the dead. Instruments were gifts from the divine. Most famously, the goddess Hathor was often depicted with a sistrum, a rattle-like instrument used in sacred rites. To shake the sistrum was to awaken life itself. Its jingling tones symbolized the cosmic rhythm of creation. Archaeologists have found harps, flutes, lutes, and lyres painted in tomb murals dating back to the Old Kingdom around 2500 BCE. These instruments weren't generic. They were finely crafted and richly decorated. Harps came in angular or curved forms and were often played sitting on the ground. Their strings, made from animal gut, sang out during both religious ceremonies and court entertainment. Music was deeply woven into Egyptian ritual. Temple hymns were performed at sunrise to greet the gods. Priests and priestesses weren't just readers of sacred texts, they were trained musicians. Specific tones were believed to align with particular gods or emotions. There was music for lamentation, for praise, for purification. Every act had its sound. But music wasn't just for the elite. Street musicians, dancers, and folk singers filled the markets of Memphis and Thebes. Percussion instruments like frame drums, clappers, and castanets added rhythm to community festivals. Women often led in performance, whether as professional entertainers or as mourners hired to sing the wails of grief at funerals. Egyptian hieroglyphs even give us words for musical moods. Haze implied joy or adoration. Shu meant sorrow or mourning. Music wasn't an abstract art form. It was emotional infrastructure. And when death came, it came with music. Funerary texts sometimes included instructions for chants and instruments. In death as in life, the journey was not silent. Music in Egypt served many masters gods, kings, farmers, and mourners. But it always served a deeper truth. That sound was the language of the soul, and through it, even silence had meaning. In ancient Greece, music was more than art. It was mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and divination. It wasn't merely played, it was studied, theorized, worshipped. For the Greeks, music was a mirror of the cosmos, harmonious, ordered, and deeply sacred. The Greek word musik didn't refer to music alone. It encompassed the entire domain of the muses, the goddesses of inspiration for poetry, dance, and song. To engage in music was to draw directly from divine influence. And so from the street performers of Athens to the philosophers of Ionia, music was both a daily habit and a metaphysical pursuit. Instruments were everywhere. The lyra, stringed instrument associated with Apollo, was central to education. Greek boys, especially of aristocratic backgrounds, learned to play it as part of their formal training. The kithara, a larger and more ornate version of the lyre, was used in professional performances and religious festivals. And then there was the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument with a sharp, penetrating tone often used to accompany dramatic performances, rituals, and even military exercises. Music was tied intimately to the dramatic arts. In Greek tragedy, choruses didn't just chant, they sang. Entire plays were structured with lyrical meters, turning dialogue into a melodic unfolding of fate. Every step of Oedipus, every lament of Medea, was underscored by rhythm and melody. But behind the performance lay theory. Pythagoras, yes, the triangle guy, was among the first to propose that music could be understood numerically. He observed that harmonious notes emerged from simple ratios, like 2:1 or 3:2. From this, the concept of the music of the spheres, was born the idea that the planets themselves moved in cosmic harmony, producing a music too perfect for human ears to hear. Plato and Aristotle expanded on this. Plato believed music shaped the soul and therefore the state. A society's moral health could be gauged by its music. Certain scales and modes were uplifting, others dangerous. Music wasn't just expressive, it was formative. In Greece, to pluck a string was to brush the fabric of reality. To sing was to participate in divine order. And to understand music was to begin to understand the soul itself. When Rome absorbed the cultures around it, it didn't just take their land, it inherited their music. From Etruscan trumpets to Greek lyres, Roman music was a patchwork of styles and traditions, woven together under one empire. But unlike the Greeks, who often philosophized about music's moral function, the Romans focused on its practical uses and sometimes its volume. Music in Rome was everywhere. In temples, military camps, theaters, banquets, and the infamous arenas, music served to command, entertain, and impress. One of the most iconic Roman instruments was the cornu, a large, curved brass horn used by the military. When blown, it sent clear signals across the battlefield: orders, formations, alerts. It wasn't beautiful, but it was effective. For Roman soldiers, music was survival. In civilian life, the soundscape was more elaborate. The tibia, a Roman version of the Greek aulos, was played at sacrifices and public events. The hydraulis, or water organ, was an early keyboard instrument that used air pressure and water to produce sound. Found in both religious ceremonies and gladiatorial games, it was likely loud, dramatic, and theatrical, perfectly suited for Rome's flair for spectacle. At banquets and private feasts, music took on a more seductive role. Women and enslaved performers often played stringed instruments like the cithara and lute, while dancers moved to soft rhythms. In elite Roman homes, music was a status symbol and imported art from Greece or Egypt, made to dazzle guests and show refinement. But music also had spiritual roots. In Roman religion, certain ceremonies required specific chants and musical forms called carmina. These were sacred incantations believed to influence divine favor or ward off evil. Over time, some evolved into more structured hymns, blending spoken prayer with melody. What Rome lacked in originality, it made up for in adaptability. It absorbed music like it absorbed gods, rebranding, reshaping, and repurposing them to fit its needs. And as Roman roads carried legions across Europe, they also carried songs, instruments, and musical customs. Local tribes encountered not just soldiers, but the sounds of empire. In Rome, music served many ends: glory, control, pleasure, and faith. It was the rhythm of empire pulsing through marble halls and blood-stained sand. Long before Vedic chants echoed through the temples of India, a quieter but equally profound musical culture thrived in the Indus Valley. Civilization, one of the world's earliest urban societies. Though much about their music remains elusive, the fragments we've uncovered whisper of a people deeply attuned to rhythm, ritual, and sound. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus Valley left behind no deciphered texts on music. Yet what they did leave, their instruments, terracotta figurines, and urban acoustics, speaks volumes. Archaeologists have unearthed cylindrical drums, shell trumpets, and carved flutes made of bird bones and terracotta. Some of these flutes, remarkably, have perfectly spaced finger holes, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of pitch and scale. Perhaps most telling are the figurines of dancers found at sites like Mohenjo-Daro limbs frozen mid-step, hair braided, torsos swaying. Where there is dance, there is rhythm. Where there is rhythm, there is music. These figures suggest not only communal celebration, but choreographed percussive culture. The drum wasn't just entertainment, it was expression, communication, ritual. With each beat, it echoed the rhythm of collective life. As time moved forward and the Vedic civilization emerged, bringing with it the rich weave of Sanskrit texts, the musical traditions of the Indian subcontinent began to flourish into intricate beauty. But those traditions did not arise from nowhere. Their earliest seeds lay quietly in the silent ceramic flutes and hand-carved drums of the Indus Valley culture that, even without decipherable musical texts, left behind a soundscape sculpted in earth and gesture. Over the centuries, music in India came to dwell in every breath of spiritual practice. The Vedas, sacred Hindu texts, were not just read, they were sung in precisely measured melodic formulas known as sama. These weren't songs in the way we think of them today. They were mathematical vibrations, designed to mirror and preserve the harmony of the cosmos itself. By the time of the Natya Shastra, composed around 200 BCE, Indian music had bloomed into a highly developed system of ragas, melodic modes, and talas, rhythmic cycles that pulsed like the breath of the universe. Instruments like the veena, with its curving body and delicate strings, and the mridangam, a double-headed drum, became both instruments of sound and tools of worship. And yet, for all its complexity, Indian music never lost its heart. It remained an offering, a vibration between the tangible and the transcendent, a resonance through which silence itself could be felt. In the lands of the Indus, music wasn't written in ink. It was written in breath, beat, and eternity. In ancient China, music was never merely sound, it was a manifestation of cosmic harmony. Rooted deeply in Confucian and Taoist thought, Chinese music from its earliest days aspired not to entertain, but to align human lives with the vast rhythms of nature and heaven. Archaeologists have uncovered stone chimes and bone flutes from the Neolithic era, carefully tuned instruments, designed not just for melody, but for meaning. Each note in the Chinese musical system corresponded with one of the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, as well as with the directions, seasons, and human organs. It was a philosophy made audible. By the Zhou dynasty, music had become a central pillar of statecraft. Confucius believed that music could cultivate virtue, and that a well-governed society would always produce harmonious music. Dissonance, he warned, was a sign of moral decay. Court musicians were trained not just in performance, but in the shaping of character. Instruments like the guqin, a 7-string zither, were played not before crowds, but in quiet contemplation. Its tones were soft and deliberate, guiding the musician inward toward reflection and peace. Larger ceremonies used the sheng, a mouth-blown reed instrument, and great bronze bells that resonated in ancestral temples. Ritual music, known as yu or elegant music, was performed to honor the spirits of ancestors and to maintain the balance between heaven and earth. Every interval was deliberate, every silence sacred. Over time, Chinese music developed its own tonal structures, notably the pentatonic scale, with its 5 flowing tones that mirrored the movement of wind and water. In this tradition, to make music was not simply to create sound, it was to live well, to act justly, and to resonate in harmony with the eternal rhythms of the universe. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, Music served as a bridge between heaven and earth, a sacred breath that rose from the dust of human longing to meet the divine. It was never merely background, never simply performance. It was prayer in vibration. From the earliest pages of the Hebrew Bible, music appears not as decoration but as foundational. Jubal, in Genesis, is named the father of all who play the lyre and pipe. In Exodus, after crossing the parted Red Sea, Miriam lifts her timbrel and leads the women of Israel in song, a spontaneous embodied hymn of gratitude. By the time of King David, music had become fully integrated into spiritual life. David himself, both warrior and poet, was said to calm Saul's troubled spirit with the harp. Under his reign, music became ritualized. Levitical musicians were appointed to serve in the temple, not to entertain, but to maintain sacred soundscapes. The Psalms, many traditionally attributed to David, form one of the world's oldest hymnals. These were not read silently. They were chanted, sung, breathed into life with lyres, cymbals, trumpets, and harps. The music of the temple wasn't confined to joy. It held space for sorrow, lamentation, and longing. After the destruction of the first temple and the exile to Babylon, music lived on not in stone halls, but in memory. By the rivers of Babylon, exiled Hebrews wept for Zion, yet still they sang. Even in foreign lands, they carried the music of covenant, of identity, of resilience. It became a portable sanctuary, a rhythm remembered, even when all else was lost. And so music passed from generation to generation, not through instruments alone, but through hearts that would not forget. In this tradition, sound was a vow, a promise, a prayer that transcended destruction. It was never merely sound. It was spirit. As the ancient world slowly gave way to classical antiquity and the medieval age, the music of early civilizations did not vanish. It transformed. Its instruments were altered, its scales adapted, its traditions absorbed into newer religious, philosophical, and cultural systems. But its essence endured. The echo of a Mesopotamian lyre, the shimmer of an Egyptian sistrum, the silence between strokes on a Chinese guqin, these sounds did not die. They migrated, carried across time in the hands and hearts of those who remembered. In many ways, ancient music is a language we've forgotten how to fully speak, but never stopped listening for. We can't hear exactly how a Babylonian hymn sounded. We can only reconstruct it from clay tablets, fragmented notation, and ancient descriptions. But we can feel its intention, its effort to connect body and spirit, time and eternity. Even in the absence of full musical scores, we still see music etched in stone and painted on walls. Dancing priestesses in Minoan frescoes, harpists carved into Assyrian reliefs, Roman mosaics showing cithara players at feasts. These images are static, yet they pulse with rhythm. They remind us that ancient music was never background noise. It was the heartbeat of ritual, the breath of ceremony, the fire of protest, and the balm of grief. And remarkably, some of it lives on. In India, the raga system still follows rules born from ancient Vedic chants. In China, guqin players still perform melodies that date back to Confucian temples. In Jewish synagogues, psalms are still chanted with traditional melodies that echo back thousands of years. These aren't recreations, they are continuations. Ancient music wasn't recorded in vinyl or digitized into streams. It was preserved in practice, in people, in purpose, passed down not through wires, but through witnessing. We may never hear a perfect reconstruction of an Inca festival song or a hymn sung in the court of a forgotten king. But when a hand drums a beat, or a voice breaks into spontaneous song, or a melody lingers just long enough to bring tears, that is ancient. The civilizations may have crumbled, the empires may have fallen, but their music still plays not in history books, but in us.